The cool autumn wind whispered down the empty street, rustling leaves into restless spirals. Thomas Bradford adjusted his wool scarf, glancing around as he walked. The sun had long since disappeared behind the horizon, leaving the world in the soft, fading glow of twilight. It was a peaceful evening, one of those moments where the air seemed too still, too quiet. That's when he saw it. A briefcase. Black, worn, yet oddly pristine in its own way, lying by the side of the road as though someone had carelessly left it behind. Thomas stopped, staring at it, his heart skipping a beat. Who could have left something so valuable out in the open like this? For a moment, he debated leaving it alone. "You don't meddle in other people's business," he reminded himself. But then, curiosity, dangerous, gnawing curiosity, tugged at him. His eyes darted down the street. No one was around. With a hesitant hand, he bent down and picked up the briefcase. It was heavier than he expected. His breath quickened. What was inside? The answer, he would soon discover, would change everything. Thomas sat in the small, dimly lit kitchen, the briefcase sitting ominously on the table in front of him. The only sound in the room was the steady ticking of the clock hanging on the wall. He hadn't touched it since he brought it home, but his mind kept circling back to it, wondering, no, obsessing over what could be inside. His hands trembled as he reached for the metal latches, his pulse quickening. "This could be dangerous," his inner voice warned, but his fingers moved on their own, almost as if they were compelled by some invisible force. With a soft click, the locks released, and he slowly lifted the top. Inside, the briefcase was neatly packed with bundles of cash, more than he had ever seen in his life. The bills were crisp and new, bound together in tight stacks, the sheer amount of money almost surreal. Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat, but it wasn't just the money that caught his attention. A small, weathered envelope rested on top of the cash. His name was scrawled across it in elegant, old-fashioned handwriting. Thomas Bradford. The ink had faded slightly, but there was no mistaking it. It was his name, no doubt about it. Thomas's fingers hovered over the envelope, his heart pounding in his chest. How could this be? How could someone have left a briefcase full of money, with a letter addressed specifically to him, on a random street? He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting someone to knock on the door and demand it back. But no one came. He gingerly opened the envelope and unfolded the piece of paper inside. The handwriting was familiar, though he couldn't place it right away. The note was short and cryptic. "This is what we owed you. Use it wisely." Thomas's heart raced. His mind whirled as he tried to recall who could have written such a message, who owed him anything, and why was it now, so many years later, that they had decided to pay up? He looked again at the money. There must have been at least $100,000 there, maybe more. His hands shook as he closed the briefcase. What should he do? Call the police? No, that didn't feel right. What would he tell them? That he just happened to find a suitcase full of cash with a note addressed to him? They'd never believe him. Worse, they might think he had stolen it. A dark thought crept into his mind. What if I keep it? Thomas pushed the thought away, disgusted with himself. But even as he tried to dismiss it, he couldn't deny the pull. That money could solve so many problems. Medical bills, the house repairs they had been putting off for years, maybe even a long overdue vacation for him and Claire. She had been wanting to visit their daughter overseas for so long. He could finally give her that. But keeping the money wasn't just a matter of practicality. It was dangerous, too. There was no way someone wouldn't come looking for it. And when they did, what would happen to him? To his family? His head spun with conflicting thoughts. He stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. The clatter startled him back to reality. He needed time to think, to figure out what this all meant. For now, he decided, he'd hide the briefcase. He couldn't let Claire or the kids know, not until he figured out the truth. That night, Thomas lay awake, his mind restless. The envelope, the money, the cryptic message, they were like puzzle pieces that didn't fit. The house felt colder than usual, as if the briefcase had brought an unwelcome presence into their home. Sleep came in fits, broken by flashes of dark dreams. The following days passed in a haze for Thomas. He went through the motions of his usual routines, but his mind was always on the briefcase, tucked away beneath the floorboards of the guest room. His every step in the house felt like a secret, a weight pressing down on him with each passing hour. Claire noticed the shift immediately. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked one morning over breakfast, her brow furrowed with concern. "You've been quiet lately." "I'm fine," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. "Just a little tired, that's all." But he wasn't fine. Every time she left the room, every quiet moment in the house, his thoughts went back to the briefcase. It was as if it had taken root in his mind, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake it. Who owed him that money? What kind of debt was this from his past, and why now? One evening, after Claire had gone to bed, Thomas found himself pacing around the living room, glancing at the spot beneath the floorboards where the briefcase was hidden. He needed to know more, to understand why this had happened. But there were no answers, only the silent pressure building inside him. It wasn't long before his behavior began to affect his family. Susan and Michael, their grown children, visited more often now, sensing that something was off. Claire, too, had become more distant, her worry deepening with each passing day. Conversations were shorter, punctuated by awkward silences. Thomas could feel their eyes on him, watching, waiting for an explanation he couldn't give. Thomas couldn't take it any longer. He needed to find out who had sent the briefcase and why it had his name on it. Late one night, after Claire had fallen asleep, he returned to the guest room and pulled the briefcase from its hiding spot. He sat on the floor, staring at it, the note replaying in his mind. "This is what we owed you. Use it wisely." It wasn't just the money that bothered him. It was the message. Owed him? For what? Suddenly, his phone rang, shattering the silence. Thomas jumped, his heart pounding. Who could be calling at this hour? He answered cautiously, his voice shaking. "Hello?" There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then a soft voice spoke. "Did you find it, Thomas?" The blood drained from his face. "Who is this?" he whispered, his hand tightening around the phone. The voice chuckled softly. "You know who I am, and you know what you've found. I trust you'll do the right thing." The line went dead before Thomas could respond. He sat frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. The voice had been familiar, but distant. Someone from his past, someone he hadn't thought about in years. As he sat there, piecing together the fragments of memory, a face began to form in his mind. An old friend. Someone he hadn't seen in decades. Someone who had disappeared without a trace. It was impossible. But deep down, Thomas knew the truth. The briefcase wasn't just a random occurrence. It was connected to him, to his past. And the deeper he dug into its secrets, the more dangerous it became. While Thomas grappled with the truth, his family was growing more suspicious. Susan and Michael had been noticing the changes in their father's behavior for weeks now. He was distant, secretive, always on edge. Their mother had mentioned it several times in hushed conversations, her voice tinged with worry. "I think something's wrong with him," Susan said to Michael one afternoon as they sat in the living room, the sunlight streaming through the curtains. "He's not himself." Michael nodded, his face serious. "I've noticed it too. He's been acting strange, like he's hiding something." Claire, standing in the doorway, overheard their conversation. Her heart ached with the weight of their concern. She had seen the changes in Thomas as well, but had hoped it was just a phase. Now, she wasn't so sure. Something was going on, something deeper than she could understand. That night, after the kids had left, Claire confronted Thomas. "What's going on with you, Thomas?" she asked softly, sitting beside him on the couch. "You've been distant, distracted. I know something's bothering you." Thomas hesitated. He had never kept secrets from Claire before, but this was different. The briefcase, the money, the mysterious phone call, it was all too dangerous to involve her. He forced a smile. "It's nothing, really. Just work stuff." She didn't believe him. She knew him too well. The days blurred together, a strange mix of paranoia, guilt, and anticipation. Thomas kept telling himself that the briefcase would fade into the background, that things would return to normal. But they didn't. Not for him, and not for his family. Claire had grown colder, more distant, her trust in him eroding as his lies multiplied. The children visited more frequently, and their conversations were peppered with questions that felt more like interrogations. It was only a matter of time before they found out. Then, one evening, the inevitable happened. Thomas was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the clock, when the front door burst open. He looked up to see Susan, her face flushed with anger. Storming into the room, followed closely by Michael. In Susan's hands was the briefcase, his secret laid bare. "Dad, what is this?" Susan's voice trembled with both fury and confusion as she dropped the briefcase onto the table with a thud. The sound echoed in the tense silence that followed. Thomas stood up slowly, his heart sinking. It was over. Michael crossed his arms, his face a mask of disappointment. "We've been watching you, Dad. We know something's been going on, but this is insane. You've been hiding this from us?" Thomas opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he possibly say? How could he explain the cryptic message, the stacks of money, the phone call, and how could he make them understand that he hadn't fully understood it himself? "It's not what it looks like," Thomas finally managed, though he knew how hollow it sounded. I didn't know what to do." "You didn't know what to do?" Susan's voice cracked. "You've been sneaking around behind all our backs, lying to Mom and hiding money in the house, and you didn't know what to do?" "I was trying to protect you," Thomas said weakly, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "I didn't want to drag you all into this." "Into what, Dad?" Michael pressed. "What have you gotten involved in?" Thomas hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. But before he could answer, Michael spoke again, his tone more controlled this time, but no less damning. "I already know," Michael said, his voice calm but cold. "I've known for weeks." The room fell silent. Thomas blinked, the words taking a moment to sink in. Michael knew? His mind raced, trying to piece it together. How? How could he know? "I've been approached too," Michael continued, his eyes fixed on his father, "by the same people who left you that briefcase." Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. What are you talking about?" Michael sighed and sat down at the table, motioning for his sister to do the same. "It's a long story," he said, rubbing his temples as if the mere thought of it exhausted him. "But you need to know everything now." Michael's confession hit Thomas like a tidal wave. For weeks, his son had been living with the same dark secret. "It began a few months ago," Michael explained, when he received a strange call from a blocked number. The caller spoke cryptically, referring to their family's past, specifically to Thomas's younger years, to a time when he had disappeared for several months without explanation. "I didn't think much of it at first," Michael said, staring down at his hands. "But then they started sending letters that mentioned things about you, Dad, about your old life before you met Mom. I didn't understand it all, but they mentioned a name." Thomas's throat tightened. He knew what name was coming before Michael even said it. David Kincaid. The name hung in the air like a ghost, and Thomas felt the room tilt beneath him. David Kincaid. An old friend from a lifetime ago. A friend who had vanished under mysterious circumstances that had haunted Thomas for decades. What did they say about David?" Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "They said he left something behind for you," Michael replied. "Something he owed you. At first I thought it was a scam, but then when you started acting weird I knew it had to be connected." Thomas sank into the nearest chair, the weight of his son's words crushing him. It made sense now. The briefcase, the money, the cryptic message. David had been involved in some shady dealings before he disappeared, and now, decades later, That past had come back to haunt him. As the truth unraveled, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The briefcase was more than just money. It was a final debt, a promise left unfulfilled, tied to a part of Thomas's life he had buried deep within himself. The guilt of David's disappearance had lingered in his heart for years, though he had tried to convince himself he had moved on. But now, the past was alive again, and it was demanding something from him. "I didn't want to drag you into this," Thomas said, his voice shaky. "I thought if I could just figure out who sent the briefcase, I could handle it on my own. I didn't know it would come to this." "Dad, you should have told us," Susan said, her tone softening as she looked at him with concern. "We could have helped." Thomas lowered his head. "I didn't want to burden you with my mistakes." "What did you owe David?" Michael asked, leaning forward. "Why did they send the money?" Thomas hesitated, his mind racing back to the last time he saw David. They had been young, reckless, caught up in a whirlwind of bad decisions and dangerous people, but one thing had stuck with him all these years, the last words David had said before he disappeared. "I'll make it right. I owe you." Thomas had never known what David meant, and when the years passed without any word from him, he had assumed the debt had died with him. But now, it seemed, David had made good on his promise, albeit in a way Thomas could never have expected. The truth weighed heavily on Thomas's conscience. The money wasn't a gift. It was a curse, a relic of his own misdeeds from the past. The people who had sent it were no longer demanding repayment. They were waiting to see what he would do with it. It was a test of sorts, a moral dilemma that would define the rest of his life. And now his family was tangled in it too. "I have to return it," Thomas said quietly, his voice firm with conviction. "I can't keep the money. It's not ours, and it's not right. Whatever David owed me, this isn't how it should be repaid." Susan and Michael exchanged a look, uncertain but supportive. Claire, who had been listening silently from the doorway, finally stepped forward. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of sorrow and love. "I don't care about the money, Thomas," she said softly, taking his hand. "But I care about you. I want this weight off your shoulders. Whatever you need to do, we'll be with you." Thomas looked at her, his heart swelling with both regret and gratitude. He didn't deserve her kindness. Not after the lies and secrecy, but her support gave him the strength to make the final decision. "I'll return the briefcase," Thomas said, his voice resolute. "I'll give it back to the people it belongs to, and I'll face whatever comes after." Returning the briefcase wasn't simple. Thomas knew the people connected to it were dangerous. They had been involved in David's disappearance, and now they had involved his family. But Thomas was ready to confront his past, no matter the cost. He arranged a meeting through the same mysterious contact who had sent the briefcase. The location was remote, an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was a place Thomas hadn't visited in decades, one tied to the darkest memories of his youth. When he arrived, a shadowy figure stepped forward. Thomas couldn't make out their face, but their presence was enough to remind him of the consequences of his choices long ago. "I'm here to return what's not mine," Thomas said, holding out the briefcase. "I don't want any part of this anymore." The figure chuckled, a low, eerie sound. "It's not that simple, Bradford. You think you can just walk away?" Thomas straightened his back, his fear subsiding as resolve took its place. "I don't care about the money. I don't care about whatever debt David owed me. This ends now." For a moment, there was silence. Then the figure nodded. "You've made your choice." Without another word, they took the briefcase and disappeared into the shadows. Thomas stood there, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders, a weight that had been crushing him for years. He had done the right thing, even if it had taken him a lifetime to do it. In the weeks that followed, Thomas's family slowly began to heal. The lies and secrets had fractured their relationships, but in the wake of the truth, there was room for honesty and growth. Claire, Susan, and Michael stood by Thomas, though their trust had been shaken. They understood now that their father's past had been more complicated than they ever realized. But there was something else too, a sense of closure. The mystery of the briefcase, of David's disappearance, and of Thomas's long-buried guilt had finally been laid to rest. And though the scars would remain, they were no longer fresh wounds. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, there was a new sense of peace in the air. Thomas looked around the table, his heart full of gratitude. He had almost lost them, but they were still here. He had been given a second chance. As the sun set outside the window, Thomas leaned back in his chair, his hand resting gently on Claire's. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. "For everything." Claire smiled softly. "We're moving forward, Thomas. Together." And with that, the old man who had once found a briefcase on the street, filled with secrets and temptation, finally found something far more valuable: redemption and the love of his family. If you enjoyed this suspenseful and emotional journey with Thomas and his family, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more gripping stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Make sure to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. If you're ready for another thrilling tale full of twists, be sure to check out our next video. We promise it's just as shocking and heartfelt. Share this story with friends and family who love a good mystery, and let us know in the comments what you would have done if you found that briefcase. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.